finally we are in the stage where East Asia is considered as ASEAN plus 3. So we understand this region as ASEAN members plus plus 3 in the ASEAN plus 3. That's East Asia. But that's, as history shows, it's not fixed. It's not something that is given. It is politically constructed. I will go through each stages quickly and how each historical episodes gives different meaning of Asia. The first, during the colonial period, before the greater co-prosperity sphere, there was a debate within Japan about the Asian solidarity. At the time, many students, including from Indonesia and other parts of Asia, went to Japan to study because one very important historical event, the defeat of Russia in the Tsushima island, in the Battle of Tsushima, where for the first time an army of colored people won against an army, a naval force of white civilization. And that becomes a very strong impetus for nationalism in all over Asia and Africa, to the extent that Sun Yat-sen then delivered a speech on this, that Asian blood was thicker than water. So Pan-Asianism was born together with the sentiment of nationalism, sentiment of independence, sentiment of resistance against colonialism during this period. But then it quickly transformed into what we understand as the greater co-prosperity sphere under Japan. Japan comes, and this is very much influenced by the quick rise of Japan in the global distribution of power. Japan was isolated before the Meiji Restoration, very not so developed, but after that Japan rose quickly and quickly became the third most powerful naval power in the world. So the change in the distribution of power affect the politics in the region, which led to the invention of the greater co-prosperity sphere, the East Asia greater co-prosperity sphere, where Japan came to Southeast Asia, including to Indonesia. So these are publications during the Japanese arrival, Japanese occupation in Indonesia, where Japan came with the rhetorics of Asian solidarity. Japan, the lights of Asia, Japan, the protector of Asia, Japan, the leader of Asia, which then quickly transformed into another form of colonization. But then, following Japan's defeat in the World War, in the Pacific theater, the New World was established based on the will of the victors of the World War II. And at the same time, we also witnessed the arrival of new states in the global scene, mostly coming from Asia and Africa. In this sense, Asia is understood as an opposition towards the established forces of colonial powers. So Asia is defined in the context of struggle against colonialism. We can trace this influence until Mahathir's campaign in 1990s for the East Asian community. The flavor of anti-colonialism remains there, and we can see still some of its traces in the ASEAN plus 3. The Western dominance idea remains to some extent there. And then in the 1970s, 1980s, we see contestation of ideas in defining the region, where on one side is the Asia as part of a larger region, understood as Asia Pacific, and East Asia for East Asia, which then transformed into the competition between APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Community Cooperation, and the EAEG. And then it changed with also the change in the politics, especially after the East Asian crisis, where Asian countries started to doubt that their partners in the Western world could be reliable, as proven by the response during the crisis. So then East Asia now defined as Asian +3, with more independent initiatives like the Chiang Mai initiative, as well as other regional projects. So from this C part, the first C part, I would like to say that regions are constructed, it is not given. So ASEAN and the future of ASEAN is also not something that is given. It is very much related to the global political context. That's why I think it is important to see not only what is happening in the region. Yes, of course, what is happening in the region is important. The rise of China, the US involvement in the region are important. But at the same time, it is important to enlarge our horizon into not only what we now consider as our region, but also its neighboring part of the region, which might be in the future identified as our region. Now we talk about region as East Asia, as ASEAN +3. But maybe 50 years later we talk about region, maybe we talk about Indo-Pacific or something else. So let's, I would like to start with President Jokowi's speech during the EORA summit, the Indian Ocean Rim Association Summit this month. The Atlantic Ocean used to be the center of the world. In the last 3 years, it has focused on the Pacific. And Indonesia believes that the Indian Ocean is poised to assume greatness. So this illustrates the rising importance of Indian Ocean in many ASEAN +3 countries. ASEAN countries started to look to the West. Of course, we are aware about China's One Belt, One Road, which connect Asia, go through Europe in two ways, the land channel and also the maritime channel, which passes through the Indian Ocean. And we also have Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. When Prime Minister Abe came to Indonesia recently, what he brought with him was this idea of developing free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And also, of course, Indonesia's own global maritime fulcrum, which put Indonesia at the center as the fulcrum of the two oceans, the Pacific Ocean or East Asia, and also the Indian Ocean. And this is also, this ambition, this rising importance is illustrated in EORA's Jakarta Accord. So this is the One Belt, One Road map, and we see this, that Indian Ocean is a very important part of this scene. We also see this, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy by Japan, which now Japan tries to broaden the horizon of Japanese foreign policy by envisioning the two continents and two oceans as one comprehensive concept. So they look at two continents and two oceans as one comprehensive region, and those to improve connectivity between Asia and Africa through free and open Indo-Pacific, and promote stability and prosperity of the region as a whole. And of course, Indonesia found another platform, which is now in the recent development becoming another focus for Indonesian initiative, is the IORA. It has been around for 20 years, but only recently becoming seriously considered as a platform by Indonesia. It consists of 21 members, which are the countries surrounding the Indian Ocean, including Australia, Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Iran, Kenya, Malaysia, Thailand also, etc., and 7 dialogue partners. Recently, there was a Jakarta charter concluded in the IORA's meeting. So why the Indian Ocean is becoming more important? First is, of course, global politics. As we illustrate in the first C, in the discussion on the first C, the development of the region is connected to the global political context. The rise of Japan, the colonialism led to Pan-Asianism. The rise of Japan led to the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The rise of new nations in Asia and Africa led to the Asian-African Conference, the identification of Asia as new forces in the global politics. The rising importance of Japan in economy and Australia creates APEC. And the failure of the global institutions to help East Asian countries during the crisis led to the ASEAN +3. So global politics affect the way we see the region, the way we define the region, the way we look at what is our environment, what is our region. So that's the first one. The second is the global economic fact of global economic connectivity that sees this region as becoming more and more important. And the third is connected also to the first and the second. Amidst the changing global politics and the rising importance of Indian Ocean in the global economic connectivity, ASEAN faces tough questions on its effectiveness. So if we look at the economic importance, these are the numbers. Indian Ocean consists of 2.7 billion people, more than 80% of the world's seaborne trade transits through Indian Ocean choke points, etc. So this is the map that I got from the marine traffic some days ago, but I believe this is still the same. The red ones are tankers. The green ones are cargo trades. And from this, we can understand how both Pacific and Indian Ocean are important for global trade. If we look at these marine cables, we can also identify. We could not separate East Asia or Pacific with Indian Ocean because the cables are connected. So what does it mean for ASEAN? The question is, how central is ASEAN with this development? The centrality of ASEAN is related to its ability to form infrastructure for regional consultation and to influence and or shapes the discussion on certain issues. It is related to its structural position as the node in the cluster of networks, as seen in this picture. But then I think I would like to go to the future scenarios. I was trying to find 3 C's for this, but I couldn't find. So maybe I'll just go with these three scenarios.
Okay.
The first is the rise of Indo-Pacific region with less relevant ASEAN. So ASEAN, in this scenario, ASEAN is becoming less effective, ASEAN centrality fades, and the major powers try to manage their competition through another architecture that will rise from Indian Ocean. The second scenario is the Indo-Pacific region with ASEAN remains at its center. So the Indian Ocean is rising, but it complements the existing East Asian regionalism. In this sense, ASEAN is still the center of the regional architecture. So the plus number is, so Indo-Pacific is ASEAN plus something larger. And the third scenario is the status quo, where Indian Ocean regionalism is not developed and ASEAN remains at the center. And of course, there are fourth scenario actually, where ASEAN also declines and we go into a chaotic power politics. So that's what I have to say. So I deliver the 3 C's. I'm waiting for the tickets to Phuket. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Shalva. It's quite very interesting that it reminds me of the questions. Lots of people might ask me, what is the significant effects of ASEAN to the normal people, common people? I'm thinking of answering that question by using Dr. Termsak. Again, may I use you as a reference? Dr. Termsak once said, we all grow up taking it for granted that we have no war in our region. But it requires a lot of effort among government leaders and senior officials in ASEAN governments to work together to maintain peace and security. And this is the very simple answer. What is the most significant role of ASEAN? To keep peace and you know, the happy region, you know. That's why also Dr. Shalva said, we as the, you know, ASEAN centrality should keep on, you know, working this ASEAN peacekeepers, this kind of thing. Even lots of people might say that Indonesia is now be very far away from, I mean, the president, Joko Widodo. And I require you would tell him that, you know, come back to ASEAN again. Maybe you expand to Indian Ocean. Well, later you answer me later, okay? Then we move to the hottest chairmanship of ASEAN for the 50 years anniversary of ASEAN establishment. What would you say now for the next 50 years as the chairman of ASEAN community? Thank you so much. Please welcome Professor Herman from the Philippines. Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to join Shokwan in thanking the organizers for inviting me here and enjoying the delights of Bangkok once again. But the question posed by the chairman to me is something that's very intimidating, actually. The Philippines has chaired this year, and looking at it in terms of setting the trend for the next 50 years. That's a rather challenging proposition. But I think it's, while I won't say it's fair, it's an interesting question precisely because, you know, it raises the question of how do you propose to start, you know, where you want to go in the next 50 years. And if one were to look at the proposals that have been made by the Philippine government as far as what it's thinking for its chairmanship, I have to say I'm rather underwhelmed by what's actually being proposed. There are a number of issues that I think need to be actually addressed, but many of the things that have actually been proposed there seem to focus on the Philippines' own domestic agenda, writ large, as far as or brought into the ASEAN context. There is more to ASEAN than that, and definitely more to what we should be looking at and looking forward to, as far as ASEAN and the next 50 years is concerned. But similar to Siseng's point, I did not bring a crystal ball, unfortunately, and I cannot look into the future as far as 50 years is actually concerned. We can, however, at least take a look at baselines that exist today. What are the conditions that exist today? And therefore, have a sense of what is before us in terms of the direction that we're actually trying to take. That's why I've actually entitled my presentation in terms of looking forward. What is next for ASEAN? This indicates the sense that one must look before one leaps, right? That we have to look at what's there before us before we actually do move forward. One of the things that we have to take into consideration is that there are a lot of parallelisms, if you will, between what ASEAN faces now in terms of the start to the next 50 years, to what ASEAN faced when it actually was established in 1967. Okay? Number one could actually talk about or point to the idea that in both cases, you're still talking about the ASEAN member states being concerned about nation building. Of course, one could actually make the argument that much of what has actually been achieved in the past 50 years has allowed some member states to advance well beyond the idea of just nation building at this point in time. But nonetheless, ASEAN as a whole is still very much concerned with the prospects of nation building. Secondly, the issue still has to do with economic pursuits. You're talking about the need to address poverty. You're still talking about the idea of making sure about the well-being of peoples. And as has been mentioned in the quite a number of times in the panel this morning, as well as pointed out here, you're still talking about the idea of trying to address development gaps between the member states of ASEAN. In other words, we're not talking about when ASEAN was actually established in 1967, one could not make the argument that ASEAN was actually composed of homogeneous or states that had homogeneous characteristics. Same is still true at this point in time, I think. And these are at least the beginning or the starting points for looking at, okay, where should we actually go? At the same time, however, there are significant conditions that actually situates ASEAN well, okay? And at the same time, one has to take into consideration the challenges that actually accompany this situation. But it situates ASEAN well, strategically, politically, and economically, in the start to its second half century. Okay? Barry Buzan, maybe 10 years ago or so, talked about the Asia-Pacific security architecture and basically said that the main characteristics of this architecture is based on the growth of regional institutions, multilateralism in other words, the attachment of security significance to East Asian economic developments, the merging of the security dynamics between Northeast and Southeast Asia, and then 3 points that focus primarily on the emergence of China. That's how significant the rise of China has been to that regional security to that architecture. Not just in security, but in more ways than one. And then, of course, the basic dynamic of interstate relations in East Asia continues to be defined by basically Westphalian principles. But the argument that Buzan was making is that increasingly, despite multilateralism, it's moving towards more of a balancing sort of dynamic. So if we look at this, and one could, of course, question quite a number of points that Buzan actually said. I think one could actually take a number of points. Number one, is that ASEAN, actually looks at the next half century, okay, as part of what a number of scholars have actually said, no, is an emerging Asian century. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. No? Second, no, is what Buzan was saying in terms of multilateral institutions, no? Particularly in terms of the economic cooperation that these institutions have actually foisted, no? The kind of habits that they've actually formed, no? Which I think, no, situates ASEAN quite well, no? Both economically and strategically. No? Geographically, and this is part of the challenges, no? Siseng actually pointed to this as well. No? Geographically, Southeast Asia, and more generally, the Asia-Pacific region is where the physical presence of the world's most important powers actually converge, okay? Meaning to say that multilateralism or not, ASEAN centrality or not, no, you're talking about having to deal with how these interests, no, converge and need to be managed, no, if we are to actually maintain peaceful relations, no? But within the context of that convergence, no, of course, is the intensifying rivalry between the United States and China. Hence the point that was actually made by Buzan in terms of the continuing or the emerging, no, dynamic in terms of balancing, okay? You might even bring into this, no, the idea that as part of this entire dynamic, no, there's an increasing emphasis on military modernization, okay? But, no, one of the things that we actually have to emphasize, no, is of course, and I'd like to point out, no, the second bullet, no, multilateral institutions, no, that are not only focused on economics but on different aspects as well, okay? Here, okay, you can see the importance of ASEAN's role. The ASEAN century that a lot of scholars talk about, no, actually project the dominance of Asia, no, not ASEAN per se, but Asia in the 21st century because of economics, no, and demographic trends. Okay, ADB has projected, for instance, that by 2050, no, Asia would contribute half of the world's GDP. Okay. Our presentations this morning actually showed, no, how much the share of ASEAN is, no, in the context of global productivity, no, within the context of that. In other words, you're really talking about, no, ASEAN playing a role, no, in that context of the Asian century, okay? And one cannot underestimate the role played by ASEAN in promoting multilateralism, multilateral cooperation, the habits of cooperation, no, that contributed or is continuing to contribute, and in fact is going to project, no, into the next century, no, the continued rise of Asia as an economic power. Okay. Together with that, of course, is the idea that similarly by 2050, more than half of the world's population will actually be residing in Asia. Okay, that's no small consideration, no, as far as both economic, particularly in terms of economic opportunities. No, we keep on hearing about issues that are being faced by developed and industrialized countries, no, in terms of their aging populations. No, Japan's turn towards technology as a means of actually addressing labor shortages, no, indicates, no, the extent to which certain societies are actually seriously considering or thinking about, no, these issues. But the point that I'm trying to make here, no, brings me to, of course, my first C.
Okay. So we are continuous.
The first C is continuity, right? And continuity not in terms of, shall we say, business as usual, right? But rather in terms of the continued strengthening of multilateralism. I don't think that you can underestimate, no, that particular aspect of ASEAN's contribution to the many aspects of the Asia-Pacific's development, right? So in this sense, no, it's a continued emphasis on multilateralism and a continued strengthening of multilateralism. Just to show you how central ASEAN has been to that multilateral, or to the development of multilateralism, of course, is this slide. No, we can see ASEAN right in the middle of the whole thing, and then all of these other orbits, no, basically overlapping with it in different ways. Okay, And this covers quite a number of issue areas, no? But the point that, and within this, no, I think one of the things that the Department of Foreign Affairs